Well, everybody, welcome to the J. Krishnamurti and Contemporary World Crisis Conference. This is the third day of the 6-day conference spanned over 2 weekends. So we are very happy to have Dr. Jack Miller, Dr. Kathryn Jefferies, and Morgan Selvanathan with us, Mr. Morgan Selvanathan with us. Uh, if you were there in the previous two presentations, we had a keynote by Dr. Minakshi Thapan, Dr. Ravi Ravindra, and Dr. Hilary Rodrigues. And yesterday we heard from Dr. Ashutosh Kalsi and Mr. Mukesh Gupta. Those were exciting panels, and as Neha have just mentioned, they are available for you to view online if you wish to do so. The links are in the chat. So let me briefly introduce the panelists to you. Their detailed bios are in the program, so you can view it there. But Jack Miller is a professor of education, holistic education at Ontario Institute for the Studies of Education. And as many of you might know who are attending, that he's a leading figure in holistic education, did a lot of work to provide a solid foundation to holistic education movement in North America and globally. And he has mentored and supervised many students. Two of them are here with us. And I have never met Jack though, but almost 10 years ago, he was an external for my doctoral dissertation. So I'm very happy to see him in person. Kathryn, I met about 10 years ago in Toronto, and then I think a few years later again in Barrie, and have had a lot of conversation with her on the phone. We have lost touch lately, but it has been really wonderful whenever I had a chance to speak with Kathryn. A very passionate educator and self-inquirer, if I can use the word. And Morgan Selvanathan, I came in touch with very recently. He contacted me to find out a little bit more about my work, because his work also focuses on Krishnamurti. So really happy to have all of you join us and share your thoughts. As we were chatting just before the session started, Jack will go first, followed by Kathryn and Morgan, and each of you have about 20 to 25 minutes to share your thoughts. After Jack and Kathryn, we will take a 5-minute break, and after that, Morgan will present, and then we will open the chat for questions and answers. Does everything sound good to the panelists?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Uh, we are waiting to hear from you, Jack. Thank you. Please
Okay,
introduce yourself, your connection to Krishnamurti, and your remarks.
yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ashwani, and congratulations on this conference that you've organized. And it's very impressive, the number of people that you've got involved, and it's really wonderful. Yeah. So
Thank you.
I'm a member of the Charter of Compassion, and actually I encourage everybody to go to the charter and sign the charter, which millions of people have from around the world. But I get the newsletter, and in early February, there was a picture of Krishnamurti and Annie Besant on the newsletter. And there was a quote from Krishnamurti from 1945. Each one of us has built up this competitive, ruthless civilization in which man is against man. And then the editor went on and said, each day as I digest the news, I return to the thinking of Besant and Krishnamurti. And what is our personal responsibility resulting in the literal trauma we are experiencing around the globe? So we still see that Krishnamurti is relevant today. The people in different settings are quoting him and citing him. I want to just talk briefly about how I got involved in Krishnamurti. As a young American who was facing the Vietnam War and the draft, I started exploring Eastern approaches. In particular, I started doing yoga in 1968, and that got me interested in Eastern philosophy. So I came to Canada in 1969 to start my doctoral studies at OISE in the curriculum department. And even at that time, I was interested in what then was called humanistic education. Holistic education as a term didn't really arrive until the mid 1980s. But there was very little in terms of an academic field for humanistic education. And but I started again because of my interest in Eastern approaches. I ran across Krishnamurti's work, and I started reading books like the First and Last Freedom, and many of those like dialogues that he had. And then I got the book, The Education and Significance of Life, and I bought it, and I still have the copy that I bought in 1970 in the U of T bookstore. And so for my talk, I started going through that book again. I have it on all my reading lists, the courses that I teach, because it is a classic in the field. And several of my students have read it and done reports on it. But so again, his work was one of the first that really provided sort of a frame for humanistic education and a grounding. And of course, since then, the field has expanded quite a bit and has done that. So one of the first things he talks about in education, significance of life, is fragmentation. He actually wrote, "We have divided life into so many departments that education has very little meaning. And if fragmentation was a problem then, it's even worse now. We have separated, of course, in our education system, we have courses and then units, then lessons, and then information. And there's very little effort to show what we call how all of it's interrelated, how knowledge is interconnected. And the problem with that is that if the child through their education sees that knowledge is separate, that things are fragmented, then they have a false view of reality. And having a false, if they think that there is no connection, that everything is separate, that leads to suffering because you do not have an accurate sense of what is. And so again, that insight of Krishnamurti is still so relevant to today. And he said, in terms of integration, he talked a lot about, of education, he talked a lot about integration. And he said the function of education is to create human beings who are integrated and therefore intelligent. Intelligence is the capacity to perceive the essential, the what is, and to awaken this capacity in oneself and in others in education. So again, it's helping the student to see what is, and I think that means how things are in relationship. Krishnamurti talked a lot about relationship and seeing relationship in life. And that from that seeing that comes wisdom, seeing how things are interrelated. And the thing that helps us see this is what he returned to is awareness, a natural awareness. And I believe behind all of our concepts and ego, there lies in each person this still awareness. And that is what Krishnamurti was trying to get us to be in touch with. Because if we get in touch with that awareness, we begin to see things as they actually are. And the problem today is we have the rush of modern life, materialism, social media, all of these things keep us from being in that place of what he referred to as stillness, the still awareness. And so education needs to come back to that vision that he had. And the problem, of course, today is that we see these conspiracy theories and all these delusions that arise on the internet of people being totally lost from actually what is. And they are suffering because of that. This lack of understanding of what is has led to so much suffering. And I believe part of that's a failure of the education system, because it has not fostered this awareness and the inner life of the student. If the teacher, in my view, has an inner freedom and this awareness, then the classroom will nurture this awareness and this compassion that he talks about. And the hearts and the minds of the teachers and the students will reside in this living awareness, in this living stillness. So, of course, Krishnamurti talks so much about this awareness, being aware of our conditioning. So being aware of the conditioning that we've had in our life. But I think we should emphasize it's a compassionate awareness. Yes, we can be aware that we've been conditioned by our parents, by society, but in a compassionate way, not in an angry way. So this is really important. And then this awareness also helps us see nature. And Krishnamurti has some beautiful, in his writing, some beautiful writing about nature. And so when we rest in that place of still awareness, we see the beauty of nature. We see the trees and the flowers and the animals and the wholeness of nature. And of course, having that awareness of nature and being in nature is so profoundly healing to ourselves and to the planet. And again, Krishnamurti reminds us that this is what how we should look at things, and to get away from spending all of our time in front of a screen, which is very, very difficult today. Of course, with the COVID and all that, we of course we have to do the Zoom and all that, but we still need to make time to be out in nature as much as possible, even if it's just for a short walk. And I would like to, I love to cite Thoreau here too, because he said, he talked a lot about the beauty of nature, and he said, may I be worthy to report the glory of the universe. May I be worthy to report the glory of the universe. And of course, Krishnamurti was worthy of doing that, but all of us, Thoreau also talked about seeking the beautiful. And he talked about what's beautiful knowledge. And of course, much of Krishnamurti's writing is beautiful knowledge. Beautiful knowledge describes our relationship with the cosmos and with ourselves. And that's another way that we could talk about Krishnamurti's work, that it's beautiful knowledge. There are mindfulness programs today that teachers are using, but I have the concern that these programs are not any good unless the teacher himself or herself has this awareness that I'm talking about. And that is really the foundation for, again, going ahead with this work, that the teacher themselves be looking at their own conditioning and their own awareness. And if they have that, if they have some, of course, nobody is totally, completely aware, but if they're making the effort to be aware, you create a classroom of love, of connection. And Krishnamurti talked a lot about love and affection. I think sometimes this part of Krishnamurti is not recognized enough. So, my work at the Ontario is involved, at OISE has evolved a lot in introducing students to meditative work, to inner work. So since 1988, in 2 of my classes, I asked students to meditate for 5 to 6 weeks and to keep a journal. And this is I believe this is the most important thing that I've done as a professor. At the end, they write like a 1 or 2 page summary of their experience. And it's just amazing over the years how this has helped students awaken. There's one phrase that summarizes a lot of what I try, is kind of they don't know the source of this phrase, but it's connected to Buddhism. The thought manifests as the word manifests as the deed develops into habit, and the habit hardens into character. So watch the thought and its ways with care, and let it spring from love born out of respect for all beings. That is such a powerful quote, because to be aware of your thought as it arises is where the liberation comes. And also to look at that thought with love and compassion, that all of these things are the beginning of healing ourselves and the planet. So I'm teaching 2 courses right now, and I've just gone through some of the journals that they're writing. I wanted to read again. They talk about awareness. I have three very short quotes from three different women about in their journal. So here's one woman. As I began to relax, my awareness came to the forefront of my mind, and the realization dawned on me. Rather than holding on to these thoughts, I simply let them pass like clouds. Over time, I felt my thoughts reduce in frequency and intensity, allowing the true blue of my mind to shine through. I also spontaneously observed a bright white light for a portion of the time. By the end of the meditation, I felt like I'd emptied my mind sufficiently to resume my daily activities. And again, a lot of the teachers talk about emptying. Again, so much of education is like filling. And Taoism also talks a lot about emptying. And unless we do some emptying, the natural awareness that I've been talking about doesn't arise. So again, another student wrote this. That's the point, to become aware of the thoughts as thoughts. The thoughts are not me. The thoughts are not reality. There's a blank space of light that exists where the thoughts arise and pass away. The space stays, and it's calm and radiant there. What a beautiful description of this awareness. And then one more. I can breathe deep if I let myself. Allow myself the grace within to come out. Now that's another, allow myself the grace within to come out. My breath brings me back deeper and deeper into the air around me and the pivot of the earth. I am one with the earth today, blessed and grateful. So again, I mentioned that Krishnamurti talked about love. And again, in academia, we're not comfortable talking about love. And Bell Hooks, who's written several books about love, she argues that when she starts talking about love with their friends, they say, well, you should see a therapist. And that's sort of the academic view that, again, it's very challenging for us to bring these ideas into the academic world. But again, Krishnamurti wrote, he said that the education is helping the individual to flower in love and goodness. Where there is love, there is instantaneous communion with the other. He also writes, what is essential in education is to have people who are understanding and affectionate, whose hearts are not filled with empty phrases and with the things of the mind. The greater the love, the deeper will be its influence on society. And I've written a book, Love and Compassion, Exploring Its Role in Education. It talks about 8 different forms of love and how each of these forms can be part of education. And again, I believe that love should be the foundation of everything that happens in our schools and our university. And again, Bell Hooks and 2 totally different people, Bell Hooks and Thomas Merton, they said, love is our ultimate destiny. Love is our ultimate destiny. So again, just a couple of quotes from students. Let's see where we're doing in time. Yeah. I also felt myself expand to mentally include others within this aura. I had flashes of other loved ones, and I felt gratitude seep deep within me. While I arose just as happy, meditation had cultivated an additional sense of compassion and love for myself and those around me. I feel blessed and loved and fortunate. I wish the world and every bird, dog, flower, and being to have joy and peace through them. I am slow and soft and awake. So what I found, so many people in doing the meditation, these thoughts of love just come up naturally. And again, with the awareness, if we are in that place of awareness, love and compassion just arise. We don't have to force it. We don't have to tell people to love. It becomes very organic. And I think that's, Krishnamurti understood that so deeply, right? So I want to read one, just finishing off, one, again, at the end, they write this 1-page, quote of their experience. So it's a fairly long, but it's so moving. And then I'll just have a couple of words finishing off. Through meditation, I feel I'm being gently invited to observe the nature of my own humanity. Personally, I had been strongly moved and transformed to the beautiful nature of this spiritual practice. I heard my voice and soul with amusement. I had slowly let my inner judge go away and be in touch with the unspoken, the unseen, and the sacred part of myself. I had achieved a larger vision of myself and my reality, a vision that tenderly dilutes my fears, preconceptions, judgments, and need for control. Because of meditation, I've been able to transform my fear and anger and resistance into joy, forgiveness, acceptance, and love. I bring to meditation anything that is for the purpose of seeing it or feeling it. The reflection and contemplation offered by this practice provides a very safe and comfortable environment where my creativity, intuition, and imagination can be enlarged. I can feel and see and reflect on my reality while I confess my own fears and personal dilemmas to the being that exists within myself. I become my own witness, my own mentor, and my own source of liberation. I can unveil the many layers that cover my real nature so I can then be able to recognize my own needs and inclinations. Meditation has been a road of discovering for me. I've discovered the honoring power that the soul possesses for every human being. Through meditation, I discovered the unconditional acceptance that is available to the heart of every human being. It is through practice of meditation that I have better understood the meaning and importance of accepting and honoring myself. So again, Krishnamurti calls on us to teach the whole person, the body, but he called the integrated person, the body, the mind, and the spirit. And this, and again, this is so fundamental. Anything less, and we have the, unfortunately, we have this image often of the student as a brain on a stick, rather than a full, complete human being. And at all levels of education, we need to honor the full human being. Nothing less will make a difference in the world. And I really believe that holistic education is one of the ways that we can, again, move forward in healing ourselves and in the planet. So thank you very much. Yeah.
That was really wonderful, Jack. Thank you so much. I really liked in how in simple terms how you kind of summarized Krishnamurti's ideas, because there are a lot of people in this conference who may not be very familiar with Krishnamurti's work, but are new to it and would like to know more about it. So I think you, the themes that you highlighted, the significance of awareness, the significance of relationship, the significance of being in nature, significance of not just treating children as brains to be filled with fragmented, disconnected knowledge, but as holistic beings who have personality, who have thinking, thoughts, emotions. How education should create a way so that all of those parts are cultivated with a special focus on being aware of your thoughts and your feelings and your emotions, and how that awareness brings about what Krishnamurti says, right? It's a negative approach. The deeper you look into yourself, the deeper are you aware of yourself, the positive qualities are going to come on their own, because that's the way the world is, that's the way the nature is. But when you try to impose positive values on you, it creates a conflict in you because you don't understand it. And I also really enjoyed learning from your students notes. I think that's wonderful, because a lot of people want to know uh, how to meditate. It's such a silly question to ask, but a lot of people are interested in understanding what meditation is, right? And what happens is there is a big market that's going on in the name of meditation. And not all of mindfulness, because mindfulness is rooted in true Buddhism, but there is a market that has emerged which tries to teach people meditation and charge them money for it and all that. So I'm really glad that you pointed out all those dangers. When I came to Mount St. Vincent University, my dean asked me if I wanted to teach an elective course. I said, let me think about it. And you won't believe the course that I offered to teach, holistic education. And I've been teaching that at the MEd and the BEd level, and students just love it. Whether they are pre-service teachers or they are in-service teachers, they crave for that understanding because none of the system is giving them. People are making them afraid of the system.
Yeah.
They are forcing curriculum outcomes on them, and the whole western and now the eastern society as well has become so instrumentalist and capitalistic. Anything that is to do with understanding yourself, transforming yourself, developing a connection with the world is no more relevant. It's just cutthroat competition to get ahead.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I so much thank you for your thoughts. Thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kathryn, over to you. Are you ready?
Yes, thank you, Ashwani. I am just going to screen share here. So, okay. Thank you, Jack. And yes, of all the things that you said, I really appreciate you bringing love into this discussion in, an academic conference. It's the most important thing. And yes, I agreed. It's not easy to bring into academia. So thank you. I wanted to thank Ashwani for hosting this important conference and inviting me to share my thoughts. I do regret that I was not able to listen to the speakers over the last 2 days, so I look forward to doing that if they're already posted on YouTube. So yeah, I can't kind of contribute to that part of the conversation. So I particularly appreciate, Ashwani, that you've invited us to speak, to bring ourselves into our remarks. I know that I find when I'm speaking from my own experience, then I'm out of the movement of thinking. And when I'm speaking in the third person as a sort of omniscient person, it's the surest way to bring me into my intellect, which is not only inauthentic, it's not good teaching. So thank you for that. I chose this slide because some of you might think this as well. If you've been to Ojai, California, and been to where Krishnamurti lived while he was there, he had an enormous series of photos in his house, and this reminds me of those. So I do apologize because I don't like to read normally, but I also don't trust my mind these days. With my students, I'm sort of able to speak a lot off the cuff, but I don't trust that for something that's important. So I'll be looking a bit off to the side at another computer where my notes are. So hopefully that's not distracting for you. Okay. So how did I come to know Krishnamurti? Yeah, I just before I talk about that, I did, Ashwani invited those of us who are speaking to possibly speak within this framework, and I've done that here. I'll mostly be trying to focus on these last two questions, but I do think it's helpful to speak about the impact Krishnamurti has had on me and my work. So I was just completing my 2 undergraduate degrees in English literature and education, my teaching degree, when a friend from my English class wrote me a letter from the Center for Learning in Bangalore. I'm actually not sure. I don't think it's called that anymore. I think it exists as a retreat center. But she was spending the year there, and she knew I was very interested in education and said, you must check out the work of this fellow named Krishnamurti. And she suggested a few books. I remember her suggesting Freedom from the Known and Education and Significance of Life. And this sounded like the most wonderful title that there could ever be to me as someone interested in education. Education, the significance of life. And so I did go to my local bookstore, and I thought I'd actually just read, because I wrote about this in my dissertation, and a modified version of it is what I published as a book called Awake: Education for Enlightenment. So as it turned out, this book was the only one by Krishnamurti in my small local library. It looked like a first edition. There couldn't have been a better book for me to start with. In retrospect, it seems a miracle there was one there at all. To this day, I remember how I felt reading the first page of Krishnamurti's book, though it is somewhat difficult to put into words. The way I think of it now, and the best way to describe it, I think, is that I had an experience of resonance, something resonating deeply within me. I have come to learn that this happens when I'm hearing the truth. I would say that I was reading information that I had not been conscious of knowing, but yet knew to be absolutely true as I read it. In addition, I realized that although I didn't understand everything he said, I still somehow felt the truth beneath the words. I had an experience of the truth. I don't really know of any other way to say it. In other words, I knew truth in those moments I was reading, not because I understood what was being said mentally with my mind, but somewhere in my being there was a recognition. This recognition is what I would call an experience of no mind, a non-rational, non-conceptual way of knowing. Is something I went into in depth about in previous chapters. This feeling was unlike anything I could remember experiencing up until that point in my life. Just reading Krishnamurti felt like an awakening of some sort. Krishnamurti was writing that humans live out of a place of fear, looking constantly for a type of psychological security that they are never finding. Furthermore, they look at life and themselves mediated through the intellect, which can only see things in parts, and thus are fragmented beings whose lives of conflict are therefore inevitable. For it is only in the realization of the whole that there is peace. He went on to say that this inner conflict within each human being must then play itself out on every level of existence, from an individual's generalized confusion or unhappiness, to confusion and conflict between individuals, to conflict between nations on the world stage. I saw immediately that this was true, at least certainly for me. My life could be summed up as a constant looking for security from a place of fear. This despite the fact that I then and still now considered myself a very average young person. Then in my early 20s with a fairly privileged upbringing. In other words, I was not aware of any significant internal or external fears or struggles at that time. So although I can only speak from my experience, it seemed very evident that this was indeed the human condition. Living in inner conflict, which breeds fear, and then a desire to look for security to escape this fear that is within oneself. From that moment of first reading Krishnamurti, I was never without a Krishnamurti book somewhere close by. On my nightstand and in my backpack through my travels to different countries to work and teach. I quickly saw that rarely was there a book of his, and there are many, where Krishnamurti would not bring in formal education and its relevance to what he was saying about the human condition, both for pointing out the tremendous conditioning of the mind that takes place in schools and for the tremendous opportunity education has to do something different than it has been doing, to help children understand themselves so that they might be free of this inner fear and conflict. So almost 25 years ago, reading Krishnamurti set me on the trajectory of my life. I went on to complete my master's and PhD focused on Krishnamurti, both in the Faculty of Education. And most importantly, I have endeavored to understand Krishnamurti's teachings actually, rather than just intellectually, which is to say I've tried to live them. When I read Krishnamurti now, I understand far better than I did then because I've had the experiences of which he speaks. From the beginning, so since 1977, what did I say, 1997, I haven't been interested in being a scholar of Krishnamurti in the sense of knowing about him and his life. being able to know what he said and when and so forth. I understood on some level immediately that in order to actually understand him, I needed to experience it for myself. Yeah, this doesn't mean that I didn't read every Krishnamurti book I could get my hands on, and I noticed that life really seemed to oblige me there. I found a cache of them at a used bookstore near my home, which was in Ottawa, Ontario. I found Krishnamurti books in the small village of Copan in Honduras, where I was living for a year, 1998-99. And even in Guyana, South America, where I went the following year, I found commentaries on living in a new friend's apartment. So it seemed that I was being supported to really learn about Krishnamurti. So the aspects of his philosophy that have impacted me in my work the most deeply, I just wanted to say a quick note about philosophy, because this might be helpful for some people. I feel that I've come to think of that word in a negative light. And I think that's a little unfair, actually, when we look at the etymology of it, which I'll get to in a second. But the reason, I do so is because I feel that in general in society, we've come to think of that word as a set of beliefs or a way of thinking, as in, what is your philosophy of life? And so in that sense, to me, Krishnamurti has no philosophy at all. What he has is clear seeing. Thinking doesn't enter into it. But when I return to the root meaning of the word as the love of wisdom, then and as the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, then I can get on board and I can talk about Krishnamurti's philosophy. Ironically, I have found in my work with students, when asking them to read Krishnamurti, that this is their complaint, that it's very intellectual. They find Krishnamurti very heady. They say they have to think too hard to try to understand. It's too confusing, especially with the dialogues. So I have to get them to take it on faith for the time being, while of course imploring them ultimately that they must not take anything I say on faith, but rather test it for themselves. But I have to get them to take it on faith that he's pointing to something completely away from thought, to experiencing oneself in life without the accumulated concepts of the intellect. I find that saying this helps them to look then to that which he is pointing to, rather than to trying to intellectually understand what he was saying. I liken the experience to someone throwing a ball for a dog, in a park, but the dog is seeing the ball being thrown. So the owner, points towards, where the ball has gone, but the dog just looks at the finger. It's not aware that there's like a possible other place to look. It's also, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it reminds me of the Zen story. At least it's come to me to be known as a Zen story. I don't necessarily know its origins. I think it actually might have been a Sufi story originally, but the story of the monk looking under the street lamp for something, and then someone who comes along and offers to help him, and eventually says, well, where did you lose this? And he said, in his house. And the question is, well, why are you looking out here? And he said, well, because out here there's light. So just this idea to me that speaks of, and I think there's, different interpretations of this, but for me, this is, the light is like the known, and that's the intellect. I'm going to stick with what I know instead of going into this, dark house, which for me represents the unknown. And so in these kinds of metaphors, I try to help my students almost like trust until they can experience it for themselves, to imagine that there's a possible unknown that they have yet to experience, in this way, trying to just open the mind, because the mind, of course, is so fearful of anything unknown that it's very difficult to even let the mind entertain a notion that there's another way of experiencing life as other than through the intellect. So in this sense, academia is really antithetical to this process, as Jack, has alluded to. Education, and to my mind, is devoted to the intellect, and the intellect is what Krishnamurti referred to as of secondary importance. The primary importance being self-understanding, which is the home of intelligence. So I came to see that traditional education, academia, encourages us to take up a position on anything, on everything, take up a mental position. It does this in an attempt to nail life down and to understand it conceptually. We could say that humanity has been engaged in this throughout time, this attempt to know life. And most commonly, it seems we attempt to do this through knowledge, which you can see is thought held in memory. Krishnamurti described it this way, but you can see that for yourself if you look. So yeah, these aspects here that I've written down, these were just, I could sort of go on, and it's hard in some ways to sum up how Krishnamurti has impacted me. But I would suggest that ultimately it would be this. And I think you might have trouble seeing this, so I'm just gonna escape for a second here. No, I can't do that. Okay.
We can see it. We can see it very well, Kathryn.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Ashwani. Okay, so this possibility that one can learn from oneself was extraordinary to me, and yet it absolutely struck me as accurate. It didn't make sense when I looked at it that others could have access to a truth that I could not have access to. So in order to rest in this ground of being, I would clearly need to know firsthand, directly, not secondhand through anyone else. So, I would have to directly experience the truth. So this was Krishnamurti was the very beginning for me. And again, this is almost 25 years ago, which is amazing. So this took some time to see this. I read Krishnamurti's words. I understood it, like I said, in a sense, intellectually, but more I understood intuitively it was accurate, but I didn't understand because I hadn't experienced it. So it took quite some time to experience this through myself as the subject. And this wasn't easy to first convince my own mind that this was possible, never mind the university doing my graduate work. And luckily I had Jack, who was, open to, I was really using myself as the methodology. Like I was both the researcher and the researched, and of course in academia, I mean, this is absolutely forbidden. So, but it was clear to me that what Krishnamurti was pointing to was the possibility of experiencing the truth for oneself. And so I had no choice but to do this. There was just no point in doing it any other way. And so, yikes. Okay, here you go. So let me move into the third question, which is, in my view, what are the primary crises that face modern society?
Sorry to interrupt you. Have you turned off your video intentionally?
Oh, no.
Or you might have clicked it accidentally.
Okay. Okay, hold on a second here.
Yeah. Yeah, you're back.
Okay. Thank you, Ashwani.
No problem.
Good to have a little humor. Okay. All right. Let's try this again. Okay. So, and how these crises have been highlighted or exaggerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, On one level, I can agree that we have crises such as ecological and social crises, and this, seems obvious, I think, to us. And to this list, I would add, as Jack suggested, a crisis in education. And for now, I also want to suggest that on another level, that there really might be no crisis. That ultimately, that this is a concept, story of a past and future. So just, bear with me here, and I'm just going to take us through as best I can what I'm seeing here. So to look out into the world and see crisis takes me away from the only problem that there can ever be and the only solution, which is to turn inward and deal with my own set of beliefs, which is to say my own conditioned mind. To meet them, to observe how I act in the world as a result of believing these thoughts, and thereby learn about my own violence, my own crises. And I would point out here too that I like the definition of crisis as a vitally important and decisive stage in the progress of anything. So not so much as a catastrophic thing, but as an opportunity. So what I've noticed is focusing outside myself, so to an apparent world in crisis. If I meditate on that, the result of that is it gives me an excuse not to attend to my own mind and my ensuing actions, because I'm martyring myself to an outside world in apparent crisis. And I've noticed too that a mind in fear about a crisis has ironically trouble taking any proactive action to deal with any crisis. I've come to see through in self-inquiry that any apparent problem that humanity faces can be traced back to individual fear, the unquestioned belief in a separate self that can die and therefore must be protected. The action that springs out of this is therefore from the mind, from the intellect, and not out of intelligence. One might convince oneself and others that they are acting from a place of protecting the environment, for example, or advancing civil rights, when there really isn't an identity that they are trying to uphold in their own mind, our own personal identity. And then these actions are crucial for it, to our mind. I'm the protector. I'm the one who's socially aware. I'm the compassionate one. I believe in equality for all, and that includes the rights of the earth, et cetera, et cetera. But intelligent action cannot come out of this mind, I've noticed in my own experience, that is at cause, interested in upholding a false identity. Intelligent action instead comes out of seeing the origins of identity creation in the first place, which is to see the equation of cause and effect. Why one does that, who or what one is when this belief is in identity and the fear it creates is absent. So the pandemic has caused those of us who are not essential workers anyway to have to isolate. Our activities have been severely reduced to essentially what we can do outside and with those in our household. And, we're on screens a lot, as Jack said. So as such, many people are noticing how much they rely on these activities to distract themselves from themselves. And this is a wonderful thing, to my mind. It's a wonderful thing to notice. So, why is it that we need to distract ourselves? What are we trying to avoid? And when you look, this observation Krishnamurti talked about endlessly really is just observe. It's our, that it can be seen through observation, that what we're trying to distract ourselves is our own minds. Distract ourselves from is our own minds, and this endless parade of thoughts that march through, of which we're not in control of that. There's no off switch, as I say to my students, for the mind. So this is the beginning. This is the beginning of freedom from the need of outside things to distract, of not feeling fulfilled by one's life and seeking to fulfill it through external things, including people. So the world shutting down, to my mind, has offered us this opportunity. It's put into the spotlight this feeling of needing to distract while also taking away things we use for an identity. So a job, being seen in our job, a routine, feeling important in some way, feeling like we're contributing to the world. So it's taken away a lot of these things, at least to some degree, and things we use in search of pleasure. Seeking these things as we do because we believe they will fill up this lack within us. So simple things like going to movies, travel, vacations. So we've been thrown back on ourselves for almost a year now, or more than a year for some people, depending where you live. And we've been given the gift of having these tendencies and things we lean on for psychological security amplified, so that we might see them more easily. So lastly here, I'm finally going to get some of Krishnamurti's words. They're all really focused around the same thing. So the passages I've selected really speak to this intelligence that is beyond thought, beyond the intellect, which is accessed by asking ourselves, learning from ourselves. This asking and this observation is what Krishnamurti called meditation, which is really a different idea than I think most people have of what meditation is. So it's this careful observing of one's mind. So this is ultimately the only thing that has given me any insight into anything. This, ground of being is being able to ask and observe through myself. And it's what I would offer as the solution to any parent crisis that anyone is experiencing, whether internal or external, observing in the world. So from Krishnamurti, it's from Freedom from the Known. He says, is it possible to break through this heavy conditioning of centuries? That is our problem. There is no other problem. And I'll just say that the bolding and italics are mine for emphasis here, to highlight these particular parts, especially because when the mind is made new, it can tackle any problem. That is the only question we have to ask ourselves. But we do not ask, we want to be told. That's this deferring of authority outside of ourselves. One of the most curious things is in the structure of the psyche is that we all want to be told because we are the result of the propaganda of 10,000 years. We want to have our thinking confirmed and corroborated by another. Whereas to ask a question is to ask it of yourself. And I really saw this eventually. It took me a long time, but I really did see that equation of, the mind believing it needed confirmation from outside of itself. Well, ultimately, I knew that would never be enough for me. So Krishnamurti went on to say, you'll forget in the moment, you forget what he said the moment you shut this book. You remember and repeat certain phrases, you compare it with what you've read with some other book, but you will not face your own life, and that is all that matters. And this is really what I've come to see, and I offer it now here if it will give anyone some small, insight. In this list, Krishnamurti spoke of this often, and I think it's difficult for my students to hear things like this. Like, he says your life, yourself, your pettiness, shallowness, brutality, violence, greed, ambition. And, I think it has helped me, and I offer it to help them, that I've come to see this as not personal, this list. Krishnamurti was speaking to me because he was speaking to all of us, because I'm human, and this is what it is to have a human mind that is conditioned, unless we can manage to uncondition it somehow. So when I first read these comments, because for those of you obviously familiar with Krishnamurti, he speaks like this a lot, points these things out. But I took it personally because I was invested in my identity, and didn't want to be these ways. But this wanting and not wanting, ironically, kept me attached to these identities, I came to see. And another way to say that is I had no space from these ways of identifying myself. So I'm getting close to the end here. Thank you for your patience. So I wanted to just, I wanted to return to a question I actually asked in a previous slide, is how would we know if the pandemic is a crisis? And certainly there can be arguments made that it is, and they're convincing enough. But how can we know for sure that what is happening is a crisis and not something good? For example, to sort of put it as an opposite, generally speaking, or is it both? So until we know how to ask ourselves, then we just depend upon the experts or our own conditioned minds who might reject the experts and take up a different position. Either way, until we know how to set this aside and see the truth for ourselves, be a flame unto ourselves, as Krishnamurti puts it, then we can't know, and that simple observation is like, we just can't know. And so instead, what you can know, this is sort of the negation Krishnamurti said, that's so helpful to use, is that we notice that we live in fear. So notice how, when you believe there's a crisis, and while we're waiting for others to supply us with answers, we live in fear. We're living in fear because our own minds are deciding things. Like, no, it's fine. This is not a, whatever it decides. But underneath this, we know that we don't know, and we're just trying to convince ourselves. So this creates this movement of fear. So we're left with ourselves, our own mind, as it has always been, pandemic or not. This is good news, because we are something we can know. We are each, I am something I can know, and that's really the totality of what I can know. So all of my studying and reading of the, ancient spiritual texts, all of Krishnamurti's books, really what I'm left with is myself. And this is just this is just can be observed. So, and, all of Krishnamurti's talks and writing, to my mind, pointed to this, sort of paradoxically, that he couldn't ultimately give anybody anything. And this is okay, because we all have this access to the same wisdom that he did, because we are that, essentially, in essence. So if we want to give this meditation, this observing of oneself, a name, I would call it self-inquiry. There's several people in history and contemporarily who've used this term and this approach. For me, who comes to mind is Nisargadatta Maharaj and Ramana Maharshi. For me, after being introduced to this possibility through Krishnamurti, I got very familiar with self-inquiry through the work of Byron Katie that some of you may have heard of. So the mind, which is to say the intellect, can't get its head around the process of self-inquiry, and I reassure my students that that's okay. It's the point. The mind can't go there. The truth is apparent and doesn't need thought to apprehend it. This is the resonance, the recognition that I spoke of at the beginning of my talk, and I'll end with it now. If this sounds too mysterious, it's because no explanation I can give will do it justice, nor give the experience of it. It's impossible. It has to be undertaken by each of us. So we must ask ourselves, and this asking is meditation. I'm just out of time here, so I'm just moving to my last slide. So finally, I'll just close with, any crisis in the world is ultimately untouchable. We need to first deal with anything we experience as a crisis as something personal, as a crisis that is internal. I found in my own life, if I find out why I'm experiencing something as a crisis, if I can see the cause of which crisis is an effect, then I am solving the crises of the world. As Krishnamurti said, when we say we cannot do anything about it, we are accepting disorder in ourselves as inevitable. After all, any movement which is worthwhile, any action which has any deep significance must begin with each one of us. I must change first. I must see what is the nature and structure of my relationship with the world. Thank you, and my apologies for speaking so much.
Thank you, Kathryn. I think that was wonderful. You know, Krishnamurti often has said, "Be a light unto yourself," and I think that's what is the, in my perception, is the crux of your talk. That a lot of people look at Krishnamurti as a philosopher, but he was not a philosopher in the Western sense of the term, intellectual exploration of subject matter, but he was a philosopher in the sense of love of wisdom. And I really liked when you said that how so many places you went into the world, Honduras and other places, and Krishnamurti was always there, right? And people may think that I am biased. I may be biased because I haven't read every book in the world or every author in the world. But if you haven't read Krishnamurti, you are missing something, because you will find very few people who are as direct and honest in saying, in pointing out all the problems and then throwing yourself at you, that you are the only person who can ever understand these problems and solve. I can point out, I can explore, I can show, but unless you are ready to take the journey yourself, nothing is possible. And of course, your students find it problematic, my students find it problematic, especially in the beginning. It's a challenge. Their first time they are facing something that is not telling them how to reform things, how to change things, how to modifying things. It's throwing them at themselves.
Yeah.
That unless you understand yourself, there is no possibility of any kind of transformation in the world, or any transformation. And I think a lot of people have said, even Krishnamurti, sometimes these social services, the social movement, they are very important, but one must ask, is that a way to escape from my own conflict and miseries, or is the action emerging because I have resolved my own conflict, and then the outward action is just natural and spontaneous. So I'll thank you very much. I think it was a wonderful talk, and it is so much connected to what we have been discussing in this conference previously.
Oh,
We have
good.
explored these questions in different ways, and I think your personal take on it and your emphasis that uh, unless you are ready to observe yourself, ask yourself deeper questions, and experience the awareness and transformation within yourself, rest everything is just an intellectual talk. So thank you
Yes.
so much.
Thank you, Ashwani.
Let's everybody take a 5-minute break if you don't want, and let's resume in 5 minutes. Hi Morgan. You are still on mute. Are you ready to share your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
So shall I begin or?
Oh yeah, please share your connection with Krishnamurti, and any remarks that you would like to share, please do.
Yeah. First and foremost, I would like to express my sincere appreciation and gratitude for this conference and all the people who were involved in organizing this. And I specifically want to acknowledge the fact to the land from where you're hosting this, and to the place across the world from where people are listening and watching this. So my first encounter with Krishnamurti um, happened when I was, undertaking my graduate studies, my master's degree in one Indian university in North India. And I was going through a crisis in terms of, really navigating the research process in terms of the theses and that kind of a thing. And also the politics of the department where I was undertaking this research. And so during that existential kind of crisis, I encountered a book by Krishnamurti in the year 1987. And it was just accidental in terms of I was never intending to move towards that particular bookshelf or something. it just popped out. And the book title was This Matter of Culture. And and there were a series of questions there in that book. And the one question which I just opened and saw was, why can't your teachers teach? Or why can't I learn? Something like that a student is asking. And Krishnamurti is responding to that question, saying that because your teachers don't know how to teach. And he goes on to say that if you were to listen to your music by a musician, you get completely enthralled and absorbed into listening to that music. And if your teachers were to teach in that way, then certainly you will be able to learn. That was something which he was saying. So that triggered me to really explore all the kind of books. And I then got a handle on the commentaries on living, the 3 series which he wrote. And it was interesting to see how he approaches the issues which people were bringing to him. So this, for people who are not familiar with commentaries on living, this is times that people are coming to Krishnamurti with a particular issue of losing somebody, for instance, and the grief they're enduring. And Krishnamurti goes through that. And in each of those things, he doesn't start right away into addressing that issue. He describes something about nature, and as Jack was mentioning, the connection to nature, and then he goes into the problem, and then it's kind of a dialogue which he has with these people, never explicating this is how you should resolve your problem, but really throwing light into the very fundamental basis of where the suffering comes from, for instance, when somebody is grieving, kind of. So I went to reading a lot of, I finished my research first time it fell, and then I had to repeat the study, and eventually it took me 1 more year to complete the master's degree. And then I did apply to a number of universities for my graduate studies to do my PhD. And I was in the process of getting some funding, so I had to appear for examinations. That time in India, it's called National Education Test. And before I could get the funding, I did get an opportunity to join a university in the south of India for pursuing my doctoral studies, and it was through competition. And they said, if you can't get your funding, you can't pursue. So the funding came in after a year, but I was admitted to the program, and I was doing my study. And again, I encountered the same issue with the advisor, not taking interest in my work, but waiting for the funding to come. And there was a lot of politics happening within the department. And one fine day, coincidentally, I see a notice on the Department of Life Sciences, where I was pursuing my doctoral studies in molecular biology, a notice for teachers at Rajghat. And so I immediately decided to drop the doctoral program and then go on to face an interview at Rajghat, and then finally become a teacher over there. So, so that began, so then I went into studying Krishnamurti more. There is the Krishnamurti Education Center at Rajghat, and they have a good collection of all the works which Krishnamurti has. And then what I encountered the situation was, because I was a person who was doing pastoral care, and I was engaged in teaching, and also managing different affairs of the school through being a part of different committees. And I somehow felt there was this sense of organization in terms of, how could one manage an organization, and what is the ideal way to do that kind of a thing. And I found some gaps in terms of how does Krishnamurti institution organize itself in a cultural, in a social kind of a way, and what would leadership look in terms of bringing the intent of Krishnamurti's views into organizing it in a cultural and social context kind of a thing. So, so that prompted my kind of a thing. And then, eventually I ended up moving out of Krishnamurti schools and then working for some other kinds of schools within India. And the career track evolved into working for a nonprofit organization and doing leadership training and things like that. So I kept that notion of leadership, and so that's what prompted me to really look into the Krishnamurti schools and how would Krishnamurti's ideas be relevant for leadership in a global context, and very specifically for the context within a school in terms of educational leadership. What would educational leadership look like if we were to really take the views of Krishnamurti? So that's where what prompted me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and uh, then go talk about some of the ideas which I have. Bear with me, please. So I've titled my talk in terms of the relevance of Krishnamurti ideas for shaping and influencing leadership. And I mean, I did encounter some studies, particularly graduate theses of people looking into Krishnamurti as a leader and what kind of a leader Krishnamurti was. So it was interesting to see that people are taking a take of, and when I read a number of books, like for instance, the work of Mark Lee and the interaction with David Moody had with Krishnamurti at the Oak Grove School, and Scott Forbes, for instance, in one of the books we wrote, Krishnamurti Preparing to Leave, the kind of challenges, the UK school was facing, kind of a thing in terms of organizing Krishnamurti into the kind, how do you organize a group of people, teachers, administrators, staff, to really deliver this education where everybody's on the same ground, kind of thing. So I'm coming from more from an organizational perspective. So and what I see is so the questions which I have is, how does one organize the educational intentions of K in a systemic way, for instance? What are the elements that distinguish a K school culturally and structurally vis-a-vis any other school? And this probably, one looks at the holistic education administrative point of view, for instance, how does a Waldorf school administer its curriculum? You can see, or what is the nature of a holistic school? For instance, Jack's work in the holistic curriculum. We have a school here in Toronto known as the Equinox School, which basically uses Jack's framework to really organize holistic education. So we can distinguish between what a conventional school is with respect to a holistic education context. But what we see is, in terms of the readings I have done, that each Krishnamurti school is different in terms of the way it has organized. So is it the cultural factor which plays into it, or is it the people who have organized Krishnamurti's education? What are the elements which make one school so different from the other? And primarily, what is the role of the principal? So how does one's personal orientation and understanding shape and influence the way he or she leads the institution? So what I had to do was, you're doing a scholarly work, you have to really look at the theories on leadership in terms of how leadership is defined and things like that. And, and then so I started with exploring some of the values. This is values-based leadership, and they have a syntax in terms of, starting from the action outwards, what attitudes you should have, and the value, for instance, whether you're interested to do a holistic orientation to transmitting the pedagogy, or whether you're more inclined to do it some other way, and the personal knowledge which you bring into in terms of experiences and the motives which drive you to do that. And what was interesting is the self, which is sitting at the center, was not much emphasized at all. It was all the other dimensions. And so one of the things is, Krishnamurti talks about values-based education, in terms of what would one call as, he critiques the aspirational nature of values. But again, I was looking at this particular syntax and saying that, could one look at oneself in terms of the different things, elements within this model? So rather than perception, you have a conception of how the values play out and what are the elements of values. So one could look at it this way as also as on a perception way. So there's this perception and conception emphasis which comes in. And again, one could look at the arenas of administration in terms of, starting from the self, you belong a part of a group, for instance, and the group may be the English department or a mathematics department. And then you look at it from the professional point of view in terms of what teaching is, what pedagogy is, what curriculum is. And then you go and looking at it from the organizational point of view, the community culture, and then the transcendental point of view. So it is interesting to see that, what the conception of how values education is conceptualized, as well as also the perceptual. But here, one of the important things which I notice is about Krishnamurti rejecting the aspirational part of it. And he talks about if one wants to aspire for something, it's something which is not there yet, and what you are currently, there's this gap, and you're under constant surveillance to really move from what is to what should be, kind of thing. And the normative behavior dictated by custom, tradition, and authority prevents self-discovery. He says the highest morality is the intelligence of right perception, is the choiceless awareness of who one is in the moment. And Radhika Herzberger, who was the director of the Rishi Valley School in South India, does point out this: values cut off from self-knowledge creates a divided self. So you may be a self which is holistic or whole, and there could be selves which are not. So there is a division which comes in between a self which is whole and a self which is non-whole, internally, or externally. You may be projecting in one way, and people may be perceiving you in the other way. So I looked at different models of leadership, contemplative leadership, in Catholic schools. How does they form Catholic identity? And here it is interesting to see in terms of what meditation, is. And Krishnamurti speaks about your take, meditation as generally understood is taking some time to apart from our daily activities. But, he is trying to point out meditation is to do with how you live in the day-to-day existence, rather than really taking time out and meditating. So what he's trying to, it is in the living, rather than in the segregating a particular chunk of time to do meditation. But there are also ways you can look at it is, most people who do tend to do meditation need a structure. And here is again the notion of, whether perception versus structure, conception versus structure, which comes into play. And so there are different kinds of theories, and I have explored all this kind of a thing and tried to see what each theory talks about, and how Krishnamurti's ideas could, kind of align, or what is not in alignment, kind of a thing, with each of these theories. For the being-centered leadership theory gives us, in terms of, human self is into different levels of development, and what happens is, you can move up in terms of the development. So again, there is the structure which is in place, and then which is very contrary to what Krishnamurti would say. So the theory is basically, is something to do with an insight in terms of how each things work. And David Bohm in Wholeness and Implicate Order points out to it's a way of looking at the world, rather than it as a form of knowledge which exists. So I'm trying to look at these things, and I have something to say about the Krishnamurti schools here. So in terms of what Krishnamurti said about the organizing aspect of the school. So here, the intent of K schools, as spelled out by Krishnamurti in association with the teachers and administrators, elaborates on a range of concerns that education could fulfill. It teaches upon intellect and intelligence, the connection between the inner and the outer world, the influence of tradition and society on the individual, and how in observing and being aware of conditioning influences of society, one can free oneself from the divisive influences of religion, tradition, and conflict. The intent and views on education as outlined in those statements on Krishnamurti's personal interaction with educators and his writings on education have had a deep influence on teachers and administrators who work in this context. each school has interpreted and shaped its school culture in distinct and unique ways. Krishnamurti refrained from calling the school as alternative schools, and he neither assented to the schools being called experimental or progressive. Alternative implied a version that was contrary or different to mainstream, or as one another version amongst the many in the alternative domains such as Montessori or Waldorf. His interest was more in relation to what constituted the fundamental basis of education and not in creating or qualifying his version as a new label under a new banner, holistic, democratic, or progressive. Even the word holistic seemed to demarcate, divide, and confine. So I looked at some of the uh, responses basically from the Journal of the Krishnamurti Schools and other sources. Here is Toons, who is a former student, teacher, and principal of the Krishnamurti School in England, finds Krishnamurti's approach as the most coherent one amongst the many forms of holistic education that he has
Morgan,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think your slides are not changing. So your slide,
Oh.
we are seeing your theoretical framework slide, but it's not
Yeah,
changing.
no, I'm just
Okay.
switching to reading a little bit about
Okay.
yeah.
Sorry about that.
And Scott Forbes, the former principal of the Krishnamurti School in England, calls the approach of Krishnamurti education as an epitome of holistic education, so on and so forth. Krishnamurti's education literature shares some elements that fall under the literature related to the diverse ways in which holistic education either draws on the views of individuals, like Steiner's anthroposophical approach or Montessori's child-centered pedagogy. But Krishnamurti left the organizing aspect to the teachers and administrators of the school and left each school to find creative ways to speak and find adequate ways to realize the highest function of education. That was to bring about an integrated individual who is capable of dealing with life as a whole. So Krishnamurti, in terms of the structural or administrative mechanisms, he offered some general considerations. Is of the view that organizations and systems should not take precedence over the vital and crucial function of teacher-student relationship. He says systems may have limited use in the hands of alert and thoughtful educators. In order to cultivate intimate relationship with students, Krishnamurti emphasized the importance of small schools staffed with the right kind of educators who are committed and work cooperatively to instill students with right values through an ever constant and alert awareness of everyday relationships. And when I looked at the responses of some of the administrators in the school, for instance, Radhika Herzberger, she distinguishes between two realms of organizing. One she calls is the realm of form and structure, and the other is the form of formlessness and silence. Gordon Pierce, for instance, who was a principal before Herzberger, uses a different kind of, he takes a freedom as the basis of organizing Krishnamurti education. And here is one particular model, which I think so, Mary Ann Ridgway, the head teacher of Inwood School, is presenting. And here she sees that the holistic education from the Krishnamurti's point of view, forming 4 petals. So one of the petals on the top is about what you love, and the other one is world knowledge, self-knowledge, and human potential in terms of it. So the intersection of each of these petals provides, for instance, between what you love and the human potential, creativity, and so on and so forth. The numbers which show in the center was very interesting in terms of, for me to really understand. So number 1 includes the 3 circles, and which leaves out the religious mind. So if you leave out the religious mind, you are responsible and focused, but internally fragmented. Similarly, for instance, 2 leaves out the human potentials. So you have a sense of purpose, but limited in effectiveness, and so on and so forth. And so I'm looking at models, and particularly with respect to the way Steiner schools have organized their education. So I'm looking at this model of holistic democracy, which is basically contains 2 elements: creation of an environment that encourages individuals to grow as whole people, and fair and just participation as 2 of those elements. And they go about talking about 4 ways of being. How does one derive holistic meaning, power sharing, transforming dialogue, and holistic well-being. Um, and they approach this matter in terms of a trialectic of structure, person, and agency. So this consists of the structure is basically the cultural and institutional frameworks, and the personal aspects include the life experience education of the person. And these three interact in a way to, uh, so in terms of self, society, and agency, here is Meenakshi Tsapan, who speaks about Krishnamurti's ideas in relation to, and she talks about agency as something that is not individual. Agency is more collective, and why we need a collective agency to solve the global crisis, both at the individual and the social level. So, and I see the principles reflection. So when I look at the reflections of principals or administrators of Krishnamurti School, I see each has emphasized, for instance, Radhika Herzberger emphasizes the intuitive dimension of it. Gordon Pierce takes up the freedom aspect of it. And Meenakshi Thapan, who spoke earlier, now she's the director of the Krishnamurti School. She takes this sacred emphasis in terms of organizing Krishnamurti education. So what I'm trying to understand is how does one, prepare Krishnamurti's education in terms of picking up any of those threads, and ultimately what it comes to is one is trying to get to the sense of wholeness. Whatever thread you pick, whether you pick up freedom, whether you pick up the intuitive aspect of Krishnamurti's thoughts, or whether you pick up the sacred dimension, which has to do with the religious dimension, and organize the Krishnamurti education, ultimately all leading towards wholeness and goodness. So that's how I see that. And here, in terms of the morality and situatedness, there are philosophies in terms of, the Kantian perspective and the Hegelian one. Moral philosophy in terms of, has tended to focus on what is right to do rather than what is good to be, on defining the content of obligation rather than the nature of a good life. And it has no conceptual place left for the notion of the good as the object of our love or allegiance, or as the privileged focus of attention. So this is a quote from Charles Taylor, and he is talking about the situatedness rather than the morals as some kind of a virtue which exists that one should aspire for. So Krishnamurti again draws the connection between goodness and wholeness, and this is how he wants to approach education. It says that goodness and wholeness should go together. Whole means good, and good has this quality. So I will not read this quotation, but again, he's trying to connect goodness to wholeness, and he's emphasizing the need for goodness to go with wholeness. So, so I'm in the process of trying to, look at the organizational dimension of how would one organize Krishnamurti's education, and what are the elements which make it a holistic organizing. That's where my interests are, and I'm still in the process of exploring that. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Morgan. Thank you. I think you are one of the few individuals who are looking at more from how the Krishnamurti's education is implemented and what kind of leadership is applied in particular schools. I have been to Brockwood Park schools and stayed there for 3 months to study what was going on there. And I have been to other schools briefly as well in Bangalore and in Rajghat. I think I would like everybody to know, as you have also emphasized, that Krishnamurti never proposed a standardized curricula or a standardized pedagogical approach, which you may see in like Montessori schools or Waldorf school. Krishnamurti was about the central purposes that you should encourage dialogue. The student should have voice in the school. That the an emphasis should be for the whole being of the student and not just for their brain, right? So Krishnamurti was more about looking at education as a way of awakening of the intelligence so that the self and the social transformation can take place. He was against standardization, and that's why all of Krishnamurti's schools are very different. None of them are same, even though they draw upon the same basic philosophical source. And one thing that you mentioned, I just want to let everybody know, if you are new to Krishnamurti, Kathryn and Jack both mentioned Krishnamurti's two books, Education and the Significance of Life and Freedom from the Known. They are really classics, and they are like really amazing books to start. And the book that Morgan mentioned, Commentaries of Living, in 3 volumes, I would say they are masterpieces of literature. You will see Krishnamurti first always begins the chapter with an observation of the nature or with somebody going on the street, and you will see the intensity with which Krishnamurti observes and shares his observation. And then in the later part of the chapter, you will see he's talking about somebody who came to meet him, whether a religious monk or somebody having trouble in their wedding or something, or marriage or something else. And then he will walk you through how he engaged with those individuals and brought them to a point, not resolving their problems, but brought them to a point of intense awareness so that they can look into the problem themselves. So those are masterpieces of literature. I really encourage you to have a look at them. So Morgan, if you don't mind, okay, you have already done that. So Neha, if we can open the chat for attendees to ask their questions and share their thoughts and comments.
Absolutely sure. The chat is open now. And
Okay.
just as people are populating the chat, I thought I'll give a few minutes and just take 1 minute maybe to share my own reflections on the panelists' discussions, because I found them quite touching indeed. And I particularly appreciated the panelists' use, Professor Miller's, Professor Jefferies, and also Professor Selvanathan, of love and compassion and non-intellectualism, non-instrumentality, connection to life in higher education, where these things are so significantly deprioritized. So it was just so heartening to hear that, people who have experienced the truths of Krishnamurti kind of existentially, it seems to me, listening to you, you have been helpless but to bring this into your higher education classes, and that it was very inspiring to hear that. I also just on the question of higher education, just was going to mention, I also appreciated particularly Kathryn's mention of our tendency to identify with various social goals and motives. And I do feel that in higher education right now, there is a demand, let's say, that we all kind of define ourselves through our identities, our ethnic identities or cultural identities. And then from there as victims or as perpetrators. And so I certainly appreciated your subtle and compassionate critique of that. So thank you. And those are themes that I will likely pick up on next time, as I have seen those things manifest in the law school where I teach. So thank you. Ashwani, we can certainly open up to questions now. They are coming into the chat.
Thank you, Neha. I think, Kathryn, that point came in yesterday as well, of the identity and the social movements to change the society. I think your comments shed further reflection on it. How yesterday Ashutosh and Mukesh were saying that how we continually create dualities, whether it's on the basis of race or it's on the basis of caste or it's on the basis of class. The dualities exist, and in order to solve those dualities or approach those dualities, we create more dualities, thinking that those dualities are going to solve the problems, but they solve one problem and they create multiple modes, rather than looking at it from a very different perspective, which is free of identity and rooted in intelligence. So the first point that I see from Nitin Kulkarni: thanks, John, for sharing your students' insights. If it resonated with some of my interactions with students, can you elaborate on the instruction which you gave them to meditate? Like what instructions you gave? This question is pointing to K's holistic meaning of education, meditation, because a lot of people think that Krishnamurti critiqued meditation methods a lot, but at the same time, he points to so many things which responds to the how curiosity of us. He's talking about listen intensely, observe intensely. So I think this question is pointing towards that. John, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. I give I introduce to my students 8 different types of meditation. So I want to give them a lot of freedom in finding the one that resonates with them. I personally, I do Vipassana meditation, but it's really important for me that they have some ownership in the practice that they do. So that's really the beginning. I won't go into the different 8. It's just, but the one of the main rationales that I give for doing this is that I believe that doing the practice enhances the teacher's presence, that they become better listeners, and they're not. The idea is that their mind and their head is not filled with thoughts when the student comes to them. They have this, again, presence, openness, and then they can really listen. And again, in our culture, to be with somebody who really listens, it's rare, right? It's really rare. Again, because of the kind of culture that we have, it's just, and so that's basically the approach, right? To give them freedom in choosing what they do, and I give them, I say, you're the owner. Like, I suggest that they start with like 5 or 10 minutes, and then try to work up to 20 minutes a day. And but if 10 minutes is enough, then that's it. So, but again, you can, I mean, those ones that I read, they were exceptional. You know, not everyone has that beautiful insight that some of them had, but the joy of reading these journals over the years, I would say, is one of the great joys of my life as a professor. Because let's face it, meditation is hard. It's sitting with yourself and being with yourself. It's a challenge, because the ego wants you to like escape, right? Let's go, like, you know, watch TV or, you know, whatever. And to really sit with yourself, it requires courage, it requires patience. And so to see my students doing that, I'm like deeply honored, right? So that's briefly what I would say. Yeah.
I have also been including an assignment in all of my courses, including doctoral seminar in educational theory. You will be surprised, where they have to do one assignment on picking up any creative relaxation or meditative activity. Now, of course, it goes against Krishnamurti's philosophy a little bit, but I don't want to restrict students to that. I don't want to impose one particular perspective on them. I think there is a there is a benefit in trying out certain things to figure out what their limitations are, rather than giving up from the very beginning. So and yes, those have been one of the most beneficial assignments I have offered, and because of the students' comments, they just absolutely love it, because this gives them something to be with themselves, to connect with themselves, and then see their academic pursuit from that angle, rather than completely focused on the outward successes and measurements of educational achievement. Now, this is a very important question, so I think I would like to read it out, and all 3 of you can respond to whichever aspect of this question you would like. Adrian Downey is asking, Krishnamurti localizes societal crisis within our individual consciousness, and you have all touched on that in different ways. Is there a privilege in this? That is, can we self actualize while in materially oppressive circumstances? Does self understanding as a response to material oppression ask too much of the oppressed? What would Krishnamurti say about the idea of privilege, perhaps specifically his own? Does he take a version of Sartre's position which dismisses privilege in light of individual perception and agency? So I have my own response to this question, but Kathryn, would you like to respond? You are muted, Kathryn.
Okay, I think I'm good. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I'm someone who loves to sit with a question and to see all aspects of it, but because we don't have that time, I'm just gonna, say what occurs to me first off, which is it's not really an either or like that. In my experience, it's that how we can affect the outer world is through our own transformation of consciousness. So that I don't know to what extent I'm successful in sort of conveying this, but I was trying to speak to that in my talk, that it's enough to observe our own violence, and because out of that is the intelligent action that gets taken. I feel like what if we don't do that, we're setting up these sort of identities where violence just occurs in the world. So in other words, if we don't understand, if we don't have love, we can put it that way. If we're not acting out of a place of love, then anything less will actually perpetuate any crisis in the world. So these things can be really subtle. I had a slide that I really didn't speak to, but I can maybe just use this example, and then I'll let someone else speak. But the past 4 years, I was referencing the United States, and most of us, I think, would be aware of what's been happening there, and maybe, but certainly seeing it from different perspectives. One perspective, is that there was a crumbling of democracy that's been happening over the last 4 years of the Trump presidency. And certainly on one level, I can see that's been the case. And what we can see is people taking up sort of identities and promoting their particular perspective and their social cause. But even if it's something that we feel like we agree with, such as sort of an anti-racist stance, you can sort of see how violence can be perpetuated so easily in defense of nonviolence. It's this sort of ironic thing. So I guess, in other words, I don't, this might not, I feel like I'm probably not really getting to the heart of this. There's more I'd like to say, but certainly for people who are sort of in a crisis of, there's violence that they're actually living with. And maybe that's more what your sort of question is pointing to. I could say yes to that extent on that relative level, for us to sort of be able to meditate or to sit in self-inquiry. I could say that is sort of a certain privilege, of course, because it means that we're not in the midst of potentially, facing the suffering, the physical death of ourselves or loved ones. So that sort of thing. So yeah, there's so much here, and I'd love to spend more time of it, but I'll stop there.
Well, I would quickly add to that. I think I really liked your emphasis on it's not an either and or, that you either transform yourself, focus on yourself, or you see the problem of the world. If you see any of Krishnamurti's talk, I can say almost any of them, they starts with the observation of the problem that the world is going through, the oppression, the crisis, the difficulties, the wars. So Krishnamurti never thought that is not the reality.
Yeah.
That is the reality, and he always pointed out to that. But I think the one thing that he's saying, which a lot of people who are interested in transforming the outer oppressive structures, which Krishnamurti is also pointing out, they feel that there is an either or, that if you focus on yourself, you will become self-centered. Because you are privileged, you can do that, then you are not interested in the outer. And I think that's what Jack was saying, that an awareness which is not compassionate is not awareness, it is something else. There is some trick that is going on. So I would say that together the structural and the transformation of the consciousness is together. It's very organic. The fear that you see in yourself transforms yourself and immediately transforms whoever is around you, and it has a very insidious effect on the structures. Having said that, I know that it is also important to change structures because they are really oppressive and really problematic for people. But from what is the ground from which the desire to change the structure is coming?
Yes.
And that is something that one has to really ask: is it my identity, my group, or I really want the transformation of the humanity so that this exploitation or the oppression ends one for and all? I think that's what is the key question: where is the ground from which I act?
Yes.
So Ashwani, I just want to add 2 points to this discussion, if you don't mind.
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, I just want to pick up on what you just said in terms of, so this thing of the self and society, there is one thing which mediates between self and society is engagement. And I would call that as the agency which you bring into that kind of a thing. So the level of development in terms of where you are in self-inquiry, self-transformation, and in terms of how do you engage with the world, with society, it's all interconnected. So the structural, cultural transformations which should happen very much depends upon the agency which you bring into the situation. And that very much relates to your notion of what self is. So self-agency and engagement to change the structural or the cultural constraints which one seems to endure. That's what I'd say. And I hear was one anecdote when Mahatma Gandhi was traveling on train one time, and the train started to move. He accidentally, drops one of the slippers. And as a train, he was not able to retrieve that one. The train started moving. So what he does is he throws the other one which he was having there, and both the slippers are on the platform now. So the friend who was traveling with Gandhi was asking, why did he do that? And he said, one will not suffice. So, at least somebody who finds it has a whole pair to wear, kind of a thing. So here I see it more from a choiceless awareness to choiceless action. So Gandhi's notion of be the change which you want to see in the world, basically embody what the change you are looking forward to, kind of, so from choiceless awareness, what Krishnamurti talks about, I think one way to go into the place where you choicelessly act, whatever the situatedness of a situation, rather than morals as sitting somewhere. That's what I was trying to allude in my talk, that if you have morality, there's somewhere to achieve or to emulate, rather than embody and enact. So embodiment and enactment is basically in the here and now, and it is in the choiceless action rather than in the choiceless awareness.
Thank you, Morgan. Would you like to read another question, Neha? Did you have something on your mind that you would like to?
I was
Okay.
actually going to defer to you on these, but
Okay. So Kelly Jian Zhang is asking a question to Professor Miller, but others I think can respond to that as well. My question is that when living and working in a place which is filled with stress, conflict, doubts, chaos, and anxiety, how to meditate appropriately and effectively so that people could get inner peace back. It's easier to feel peace, love after doing meditation when living in a peaceful and friendly place. But when the circumstances become unsafe and bring fear, it's too hard to have psychological security at that time. What kind of meditation could help to recover both mental and physical health? So maybe both Jack and probably Kathryn can respond to this question.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something. Jack, did you want to go ahead?
I do a lot of work with loving kindness meditation. First of all, sending loving kindness to yourself and then to others. And again, the fruits of our meditation should be compassion. So if we are in struggle And again, like the means that we do to change should be based in the awareness and not any kind of instrumentality. Which again, what I think that's been a lot of problem with some of the social change movements. They've been, and again, Krishnamurti was very critical of like overemphasis on technique and strategy. And I think some of these movements, they've focused on strategy and technique and not on, again, the consciousness or the awareness. So, I think, and again, I think too much focus on mindfulness without the compassion is a problem. And so bringing that is, I think, so. But again, I'm speaking from a place of privilege, right? I'm not one that's in a place where there's a lot of suffering. But so that's why I looked a lot to Gandhi, because he talked again about nonviolence as a way of inquiry, right? Because we know so little in terms of about nonviolent change, right? And he saw it as like an investigation. How can we investigate the uses of nonviolence? And to see it in that way, I think is I think it is very, very helpful. Yeah.
Thanks, Jack. Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I would just, for me, the way of working with my mind that has been so effective is to notice something very simple, which is it the circumstances in which I'm living that are causing my suffering, or is it what I'm thinking about the circumstances that is causing my suffering? This is where, what Krishnamurti pointed to, this freedom, because it's yes, we could talk about sort of relative suffering. Some of us are in conflict violent zones, but we're really pointing to something that's the human condition, that no matter where we live, we all experience this fear, this psychological fear. We would have to if we're believing in death of the body, which most of us do. So this sort of living in fear, to me, being able to identify exactly what I'm thinking and believing in any given moment, that I'm aware of this fear in me, and then being able to question whether those beliefs and concepts are true, that's been the source of my freedom. And that actually speaks to like a really beautiful, important question that the previous questioner asked in that long set of questions, Adrian, that, does self-understanding as a response to material oppression ask too much of the oppressed? And to that, I would just say, it's actually the only thing that I feel like can actually help end suffering, which is not to say that we shouldn't be acting to alleviate material oppression. Of course, like, Ashwani, you've said these structures are so important, and there's something we can be doing to alleviate our own suffering. And that is actually seeing what's true in the moment, seeing what is reality and what is just beliefs and concepts that we've constructed, so that's the unconditioning process. And that's meditation to me, and how I understand Krishnamurti meant it.
I think that is so important to understand, right? So if like people have been in operation throughout human history and in all locales and context, and that continues to happen, right? So I think what I am understanding from Krishnamurti, that operation comes from a place of self-centeredness, my own fear, my own greed, that causes all that has I think capitalism is a manifestation of human greed for more and more and more. So I think that's why the question of oppression has to be understood at two levels. One is, how am I perpetuating oppression? So even if I may come from an oppressed context, I may still be violent. I may still have fears. I may still be self-centered. So I think that's where Krishnamurti is bringing everybody on the same level, that the human consciousness is one.
Yeah.
Now, but that doesn't mean that there are no material disparities and there is no, some people are more oppressed in really bad conditions. To ask them to think about serious questions of life or bigger questions of life, yes, it is too much. But unless we begin to ask at least some of those who can ask, I don't think how we can take care of discrimination, how can we take care of poverty, it's impossible. So whoever can, and to whatever extent can, these fundamental questions have to be asked. If there has to be, that's what Krishnamurti calls radical transformation. If we want to see radical transformation on the society, otherwise it will be uh, social movement based, social activity based, it will be charity based. It won't be rooted in love and compassion and a transformed consciousness. Having said that, I don't want to take the final words, but we are over 4 minutes. So Kathryn, Jack, and Morgan, can you very briefly share if you would like to share a concluding thought? We can start with Morgan.
Yeah, Ashwani, thank you very much. You know, from what you just said, you know, Ravi Ravindra wrote a small book, and he basic title was about a self-centered versus centered self, and the whole notion of, you know, you may be expressing oppression as you just said, but you may be perpetuating oppression by being violent to your wife, to, you know, to your son or daughter, or to your coworker, by just staring, gazing at the particular person. So, I mean, so one has to really look into oneself. That's what I would say. And so any problem, which seems to be the previous question also, what happens is, you know, how does the self manifest itself in terms of its self-centeredness, whether it is enduring oppression, whether it is enduring violence, and is there a different self which could come through rather than the self, and it is through the self-transformation which should be radical enough to change your perspective to see a different self.
Thank you. Jack?
Yeah, again, being in that place of awareness that Krishnamurti talks about and that we all have access to is also a place of joy. And I think being in that place can bring us, again, a very deep happiness and joy. And if you look at, again, Gandhi and the Dalai Lama and so many people, they radiate joy, even though they've been through the suffering. So this, like, think that we have to be this, you know, unhappy with all the suffering. We can still experience joy and still feel compassion for those that are suffering.
Thank you. Kathryn?
Thanks, Ashwani. I actually just noticed a question from Gopal Krishnamurti, who's an old friend of mine who I haven't spoken to in many years. And hi, Gopal, if you're still on the call on the Zoom. But I might just say something finally as just a quick answer to his longer question. But just to abbreviate it, Krishnamurti seems to question I challenge the notions of he lists many things, but including understanding oneself. This seems to question the very existence of a self. So what is self-inquiry and what is education when the very existence of the self is questioned? And yeah, I would say that in a profound way, Krishnamurti asks us to get in touch with that. What are we experiencing as the self, you know, as who we are? So in you know, like I in Zen, you know, it's big mind, little mind, or, you know, some people say small letter S self and capital letter S self, and course, in the end, these are just concepts, but in terms of, that's all we have, right, is language to share with one another. So, you know, yeah, self-inquiry to me, in the way that Krishnamurti meant this, is asking of it of yourself. And the answer, in my experience, does not come through the intellect. You know, this is what meditation is like. So, you know, this is the term for me that self-inquiry points to, that Krishnamurti was pointing to. It's asking of yourself, and noticing, you know, the answers through your own observation. So it's not consulting the intellect there. It's not consulting the movement of thought. And to me, you know, this is when Krishnamurti said, to understand life is to understand yourself, and that is both the beginning and the end of education. That is what ultimately education, I think, the highest, you know, we could say, highest ideal, maybe not the right word, but highest good of what it could offer, ultimately is to understand deeply what this is, this nature of the self. Because in my experience of that, as Ashwani has said, this centeredness, this idea of a self that keeps us rooted in a center, is what prevents me from acting in the world. You know, it keeps me rooted in fear. And so, yeah, that's some closing thoughts. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you so much, and I apologize to the attendees if we can't attend to all the questions and all the comments. It's difficult because of the time and everybody's time. But I would just like to conclude the current session by thanking Jack, Kathryn, and Morgan. Thank you so much for taking time to share your thoughts with all of us. I think it was quite engaging discussion, and we are continuously exploring some of the fundamental questions in all the sessions. So there is those who are attending all the sessions, they will see that there is a connection and deepening of the conversation that we are having. So again, thank you so much for taking the time out, and best wishes to you all. And everybody, our next part of the conference will start next Friday at the same time, 11 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time and 8:30 p.m. India time. So please join us, and you can see the program for the speakers and all other details. So look forward to seeing many of you again on Friday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.